Though just about everyone agrees that the first Back to the Future film is the best, there isn't really an overall consensus of whether the second or the third is the runner-up. Given that Part 3 simply isn't as beloved as the original, then there is probably a lot that you missed in that movie. So, with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 20 things you somehow missed in Back to the Future Part 3. Number 20, Doc's bandana was made from his shirt in Part 2. We'll kick things off with something that actually paid off a reference in Back to the Future Part 2. Early on in that second film, Doc wears a shirt with a distinctive yellow, blue, white colour scheme. But if you look closer beyond the colours, you might also be able to make out men on horseback chasing a train. Beyond the fact that this is, of course, foreshadowing the Western theme of Back to the Future Part 3, we actually do see this shirt again in the sequel. And that's because Doc wears it around his face as a bandana while carrying out a stick-up. It was difficult to make this out in prior resolution releases of the film, but take a closer look and it's very much there. Number 19, that Clint Eastwood inside joke. Early in the film, when in 1955 Doc and Marty are planning to go back in time to 1885, we get this cute little exchange. In this scene, Marty gets dressed into area-appropriate duds and says, "Clint Eastwood never wore anything like this," to which Doc then replies, "Clint who?" Marty then fires back, "Oh, that's right, you haven't heard of him yet." And given that, of course, Eastwood hadn't become a household name by Doc's time of 1955, this does check out. However, there is an added wrinkle to this scene. And this is because you might notice that Marty also takes a fleeting look at two of the drive-in cinemas posters. For Revenge of the Creature and Tarantula, two movies produced in 1955 and in which Clint Eastwood actually starred in uncredited cameos. It would take nearly another decade from this point for Clint Eastwood to break out in A Fistful of Dollars, but these movie posters are references to the fact that the actor was then an up-and-comer. Number 18, Marty checks that his pants are still on. Shortly after travelling back to 1885, Marty is knocked out and then cared for by his great-great-grandparents Maggie and Seamus McFly. After waking up in bed at their home and chatting with Maggie, there is a fleeting second where Marty actually looks under the blanket. The scene is rather low lit, so you might not notice that he's actually checking to see if he's wearing pants underneath there. And of course, this is a reference to the unforgettable moment in the first movie where Marty is hit by a car and then wakes up in Lorraine's bed to the realization that, yeah, he's not wearing any pants under the covers. Number 17, the time is 8:08 on the clock tower, as in 88 miles per hour. While at the Hill Valley Festival, Doc and Marty get a photograph taken in front of the new clock that's about to be installed in the town's clock tower. However, if you look closely at the time, you will notice a cute little reference. That's because the time on the clock is 8:08, and why is that significant? Well, give me a second. Given that 88 is surely the most significant number in the Back to the Future franchise, being the speed that the DeLorean needs to reach in order to travel through time and all, it's probably no coincidence that we see this number slyly referenced by this giant clock. Number 16, ZZ Top plays the town band. You'll likely be aware that the legendary rock outfit ZZ Top provided the track Double Back for the film's soundtrack, but you might have missed the fact that they actually turn up in the film in the flesh themselves. See, despite their distinctive look, they rather blend into the ambience of the Hill Valley Festival, playing hairy members of a fiddle band who perform, would you guess it, an Old West-style version of Double Back. In a recent interview, bassist Dusty Hill actually recounted the experience, saying, quote, "We stopped by the set one night, I can't remember where it was, somewhere out in California. They built a whole damn western town. It was really cool. Anyway, they were doing all-night shooting, so we stopped by at midnight or 1 a.m, and they were shooting this scene. They broke for lunch, and I remember that I made sure I was sitting over there by Robert Zemeckis, the director, and I kept saying, you know, it looks like we belong in this movie. I mean, you don't hardly even need to use makeup on us. They already had a band, so they just added the three of us to it." End quote. Number 15, Doc references the invention of the transistor. Early on in 1955, Doc reads out his own 1885 letter, which includes the passage, quote, "I set myself up as a blacksmith as a front while I attempted to repair the damage to the time circuits. Unfortunately, this proved impossible because suitable replacement parts will not be invented until 1947. Though it's hardly important to the story that Doc is talking about here, what he's actually referring to is the invention of the transistor in 1947. This was invented by American physicists John Bardeen and Walter Brattain at Bell Labs in the same year. Number 14, cinematographer Dean Cundey's cameo. Legendary cinematographer Dean Cundey lent all three Back to the Future movies with regular collaborator Robert Zemeckis. And while general audiences probably couldn't pick a famous cinematographer out of a lineup, Cundey does have a distinctive look, and of course, he's a decorated cinematographer in his field. He is a well-known person. Even so though, dressed up in period duds, a fancy hat, and a giant beard that may or may not be real, he effortlessly slides into the background of a scene in Back to the Future Part 3 as the photographer taking Doc and Marty's picture by the clock. Number 13, Needles' gang includes members of Biff's various other gangs. In 1985, at the end of the movie, Marty manages to avoid getting into a race with Needles' gang, but if you look closely, you might recognize the other three gang members in this scene. And that's because each of the three actors previously played a member of Biff's gang in each of the three movies. J.J. Cohen played the skinhead in Biff's 1955 gang in the original film, Ricky Dean Logan played Data in Griff's 2015 gang in the second movie, and Christopher Wynn was an unnamed member of a gang in Part 3. Number 12, the clock tower is being unloaded in the background. For further proof of just how much attention to detail is packed in these movies, look no further than the scene where Doc and Marty are talking to the train conductor about the speed of the train. Keep your eyes peeled and you'll notice that the iconic clock for the clock tower is being unloaded off the train in the background. Now this is easily missed if you're only focusing on what's happening in the foreground of the scene, but once you notice it, you'll never be able to watch this scene the same way again. Number 11, Doc named his dogs after scientists again. Now, you might remember that Doc named his dogs after Einstein and Copernicus in the first Back to the Future movie, and that's a naming convention that actually follows through to Back to the Future Part 3. In 1885, if you look closely around Doc's barn, you'll see banners for his new dogs which have the names Galileo, Archimedes, and Newton. Fittingly, in the very first moments of the movie, when we get a glimpse of Doc's fireplace in 1955 as well, Doc has pictures of Isaac Newton, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Edison, and Albert Einstein, confirming just how much these scientists and their achievements meant to him. Number 10, the clock that caused Doc's accident is visible. Now you might remember that in the first movie, Doc explains that he got the idea of the flux capacitor after trying to install a clock above his toilet and then failing and hitting his head off the sink. In Part 3, however, as Doc freaks out upon seeing Marty in his home, he runs into the bathroom and for a few scant seconds we can see the interior, where, lo and behold, there is indeed the famous clock hanging above the toilet. Number 9, Clara is in the background when Doc and Marty talk about the CLAYTON ravine. When Doc and Marty are figuring out their plan to get the DeLorean to 88 miles per hour without any gasoline, they look at the Hill Valley map and notice an unexpected name for the ravine. They say, quote, "Funny, this map calls CLAYTON Ravine Shonash Ravine. That must be the old Indian name for it. It's perfect," end quote. While the two are discussing this, however, if you actually look in the background of the scene, you can see Clara Clayton waiting to talk to Doc. Doc, being distracted by Marty, then causes Clara to find her own transportation, leading to her eventual fateful encounter at the ravine, which, without Doc and Marty's intervention, would have led to her death and the ravine being renamed to CLAYTON Ravine. Number 8, the saloon extras are all legendary Western actors. During the saloon scene, you might remember 3 distinctive-looking old-timers right at the front of the bar who sound off when Marty enters the scene. But these aren't just 3 random extras that were thrown in to look cool. In fact, these 3 actors are Dub Taylor, Pat Buttram, and Harry Carey Jr., all character actors who spent decades playing sidekicks and various supporting roles in a glut of Western films and TV shows. Taylor had more than 250 credits to his name prior to his death in 1994. Buttram was best known for playing the sidekick to Gene Autry, and Carey was the son of legendary silent film star Harry Carey. Number 7, the arresting deputy's dialogue was redubbed. Later in the movie, Griff's great-grandfather, Buford Mad Dog Tannen, is arrested after being kicked into a load of manure by Marshall Strickland's deputy. The deputy then announces that Buford is under arrest for robbing the Pine City stage, yet at the moment that the charge is read, the shot actually cuts away from the deputy to a reverse shot of Doc and Marty. And the reason for this? Well, initially, Mad Dog was actually charged for killing Marshall Strickland himself, but his crime was later changed in post-production. The original scene is still featured on the home video releases, but was deemed too dark at the time, and as such, this cut was papered over with the shot of Marty and Doc. And the redub was just put on top of that. Number 6, Doc is probably related to Werner von Braun. Early on in the film, Doc explains his ancestry to Marty, explaining, quote, "The Browns didn't come to Hill Valley until 1908, and then they were the Von Brauns. My father changed our name during the First World War." Now this might just seem like a random piece of character building. That is, until you realize that Bob Gale was probably trying to imply that Doc is actually related to Werner von Braun. Now who is that dude? Well, Von Braun was a Nazi rocket scientist who helped develop the V2 rocket for the Germans, and following the war was relocated to the US, where he worked for NASA as the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vessel. Number 5, the Statler horse dealership. First up, major props to anyone who caught this one. In 1885, there is a horse dealership by the name of Honest Joe Statler, yet chronologically, this was just the first of the Statler family's various transportation businesses in Hill Valley throughout the years. And that's because in the first films in 1955, the Statler family's business is a Studebaker dealership by the name of Statler Studebaker, while in 1985, it had again been renamed to a Toyota dealership, that being the Statler Toyota. Number 4, Clayton Ravine is renamed to Eastwood Ravine at the end. Now this one seems obvious, and yet it's easily missed all the same. At the end of the film, when Marty returns to 1985, Hill Valley's infamous gorge, Clayton Ravine, has now been renamed to Eastwood Ravine. And that is, of course, because Doc prevented Clara from falling to her death in the ravine in 1885, and as such, the ravine got a different name. Instead, it was actually named after Marty, or at least the Clint Eastwood name that he was going under during this time, and that's how we end up with the name change at the end of the film. Number 3, Doc's son desperately needs the bathroom. Now this one is admittedly pretty infamous these days, but unless you're chronically online, you might have managed to miss it yourself. Right at the end of the movie, when Doc and Clara reappear in 1985 in a steam locomotive time machine with their 2 sons, keep an eye on their rightmost child, Vern. And that's because all the way throughout this scene, Vern can actually be seen pointing at his groin, seemingly indicating to a crew member off stage that he needs to go to the bathroom real bad. How this made it into the final cut is pretty fascinating, because once you notice it, it's very clear that this kid isn't acting, but still, now it's a part of movie history. Number 2, the flux capacitor is visible in the train. When Doc's time travel locomotive takes off, keep an eye on the front portion of the set and you might notice something a little bit familiar. And that's because, yep, that is the flux capacitor, the technological doodad that makes time travel possible, installed where you'd usually expect the train's light to be. It's an interesting design change because originally the flux capacitor is inside the DeLorean to keep it safe, but you can probably assume that with a big locomotive like this, it's probably safe right up front and center. Now that's another one that might seem obvious in retrospect, but I'm absolutely betting that someone out there definitely didn't notice this. Number 1, Police Academy's Michael Winslow performed the sound effects for Marty's moonwalking. Even if you've watched Back to the Future Part 3 from beginning to end multiple times, he's a credit you still probably missed. In the Producer's Wish to Thank section of the credits, you'll find the name Michael Winslow. Yes, the very same Michael Winslow, famed for his uncanny ability to create realistic sound effects using only his voice. And that's because Winslow, best known for his appearances in the Police Academy movies, was actually the sound effects guy for Marty's feet. And somewhat poetically, a few years prior, Winslow had actually presented the Best Sound Editing Oscar to Charles L. Campbell and Robert Routledge for their work on the original Back to the Future. You know, it's like poetry, it rhymes. It's a different franchise, but I wanted to get that reference in. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. How many of these Back to the Future Part 3 details did you spot? And are there any that surprised you in here? Let me know, and while you're down there, could you also please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to whatculture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.